All right, so in this presentation, we are going to begin discussing social structures and social problems. So the learning objectives for this particular presentation are pretty straightforward. The first is to define what social structures and social problems are. Since this course is literally titled Social Problems, it's probably obvious that that is a very important term that we're going to be working with throughout the semester. But social structures are equally important for this course, as we'll explain in this presentation. The other objective is to understand how social structures specifically contribute to systems of inequality, which result in these social problems that our course is going to focus on. So to begin, I thought it might be helpful. I know some of you may have taken Intro to Sociology or other sociology courses before, but for many of you, this may be your first exposure to a sociology course. So just a really quick background on this field. Like I mentioned in the first video that I posted, kind of prefacing and giving kind of a warning, if you will, about your first exposure to sociology. Sociology is a science, but it didn't just develop out of thin air. Essentially, the Industrial Revolution brought with it a number of never before seen problems in our society. Before the Industrial Revolution, families were largely kind of operating in this agricultural framework where the family unit was fairly self-sufficient on its own, or maybe was self-sufficient within its own small community. But the Industrial Revolution brought with it this kind of, as the name suggests, an industrialization of society. You know, factories were being produced at these heavy rates. The workforce was very different in our society, and created this very stark division of labor between the paid workforce and the unpaid workforce. And just along with this big change, this huge social change in society, came with it a lot of problems. And a number of academics were starting to realize that other fields of science existed, you know, things like psychology, anthropology, etc., which are kind of related, kind of like close cousins to sociology, but none of these other fields of social sciences specifically focused on solving these problems that were being created in society by the Industrial Revolution. So scholars began applying the scientific method to the social world and the problems that they were presented with. And that was kind of the birth of sociology. So I kind of liken sociology to engineering, but instead of being in the physical world, we're kind of focusing on the social world. So engineers' main job are to kind of solve problems that have to do with physical structures, right? Buildings or technology, machinery, etc. Well, in sociology, our focus is on really solving problems that are related to social structures. And so the majority of this presentation today, we're going to be talking about what these social structures are, what their purpose is in society, and then most importantly, how they kind of relate and contribute to the specific focus of social problems. So let's talk a little bit about the sociological perspective. Oftentimes you'll hear a lot of courses in sociology are framed around this grand idea called the sociological perspective. And essentially what that refers to is this kind of framework of thinking that strives to understand the structural basis of human experiences and behaviors. So social structures are societal frameworks that guide, influence, and limit human behaviors. All right, so we're going to get into a lot more detail about social structures here today, but I think a good kind of visual to think about in your head for a social structure is just kind of like a pathway. All right, imagine you're in a maze. All right, you enter into a maze and you just keep kind of following paths, and then every once in a while you might come to a fork in a road where you as an individual get to decide, okay, do I want to turn left? Do I want to turn right? Or do I want to keep going forward? So as an individual, you get to make that choice. And in the United States, we really celebrate this idea of individual thinking and free will, that we as individuals are in control of our own destiny and in control of the own decisions that we get to make. I get to choose if I want to go left, straight, or to the right. But realistically, the choices that we have are really limited by the pathways that are presented to us in that maze. So in that kind of way, that maze is kind of a good visual aid to think of as a social structure. It's this framework that's created by the society that you live in that influences, guides, or in some way limits the individual choices or behaviors that you have to make. Okay? So another simplified way to think about social structures would be to call them normalized patterns of social relationships within a society, right? Sociology is the science of studying patterns of predictable human behavior. So as we'll talk about throughout this presentation and in the coming weeks here, human beings become very predictable when we look at them at the group level, right? If I went up to any given individual and asked them what they wanted to be when they grew up, I would probably have a really hard time predicting what that individual is going to choose. But if I had some information about the groups that that individual belonged to, for example, if I knew that person's gender, if I knew their socioeconomic status, if I knew if they had college-educated parents, I could probably make a much more informed guess or prediction about what that individual wanted to be when they grew up. Not because I'm psychic, but because I can make a prediction based off of patterns of human behavior. I know that men are more likely than women to enter into certain areas of the workforce. I know that your socioeconomic status likely has an impact on the types of jobs that you consider to be attractive. I know that individuals with college-educated parents are far more likely to pursue occupations that also require a college education. So sociology is really like the science of becoming a mind reader, right? It's really cool in that way. We predict how people are going to behave or react in certain situations based off of what we know people from similar situations or similar backgrounds have the decisions that they've made in the past. Right. So social structures, again, the pathways or incentives created by social structures largely influence individual choices that we make every single day. The structural shaping of choices is often easier seen at the group level rather than at the individual level. Like I said, if we can kind of categorize how all men behave in comparison to women with regard to a certain idea or preference, it's a lot easier to see, oh wow, this group of people tends to have more in common in comparison to other groups. So we can see the effects of social structures, things like gender. Gender is a great example of a social structure in society because it helps us predict those patterns of human behavior. Social structures are so pervasive in society that their influences are often taken for granted. The behaviors they guide us to do seem quote unquote normal to us, right? So me personally being a man, right, I probably didn't think too deeply when I was growing up that I didn't want to become a secretary, all right? So this is because there is a kind of sexist belief in our society that's informed by the social structure of gender that being a secretary or being an administrative associate is a woman's job, right? And so because I had this idea ingrained in my mind that being a secretary or an administrative assistant was a woman's job, I subconsciously never even considered that as a possible career path for myself, right? So we don't even think oftentimes about the influence that social structures have over our behaviors just because we are indoctrinated into this way of thinking. In my introductory discussion post, I mentioned that while I now identify as part of the LGBT plus community, that was never anything I even considered until I graduated from high school and moved off to a bigger city for college and started getting exposed to different people and different ways of thinking. Because in my small hometown, we never talked about the LGBT plus community. You know, I was raised in a Catholic household, so the religion that I was raised in did not look favorably upon sexual minorities. I went to a school that taught abstinence-only sexual education, so I definitely wasn't going to be educated about the LGBT plus community in school. And my family was relatively conservative, and we just didn't talk about anything related to sexuality. So I had no exposure to anything other than heterosexuality until I was 18 and moved to a different culture in a different city. and started to get exposed to different ways of thinking. So in that way, religion, education, and my family were all social structures that really limited my understanding and therefore my ability to identify as anything other than heterosexual until I got older and was exposed to different ways of thinking, right? So social structures are so pervasive, we often don't even know that they're affecting us or affecting our decision making, but they are everywhere. They're impossible to escape in society. So gender is a great example of a social structure. It's something that we all are affected by every single day, whether or not we even think about it. And it's something that is so pervasive that the kind of framework of gender that guides and limits our behaviors and choices is, again, something we take for granted constantly, right? So let's look in more detail, specifically using gender as an example of a social structure to get a better understanding of exactly what these social structures are and how significant they are in our lives. Okay, so for centuries in the United States, women were not allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to own property. They weren't allowed to possess their own income. They weren't allowed to participate in government. And this was all because the social structure of gender in the United States prohibited them from doing so. The social structure of gender informed women that their place was in the home and that they were to be subservient to men. That was the expectation for women within the social structure of gender for the first several hundred years that the United States existed as an independent nation. Now, is there some inherent or naturally occurring gendered system that says women shouldn't be able to vote or work or possess their own income? No, those were all behaviors or ideas that we as a society collectively agreed upon for a long period of time. And it wasn't until a growing number of women started to stand up and advocate for themselves that this social structure of gender changed and allowed them to access these behaviors that were previously off limits to them. And we'll talk more about that in just a bit here. So social structures shape individual behaviors, but social structures are also created by individuals. So this is a really important tenet of sociology here. The term a social construct refers to any idea or system that has been created and accepted by the people in a society, all right? So, for example, the decision to keep women out of positions of power, to keep women in the home raising the family instead of allowing them to go to work or own property or vote, those beliefs, those rules in society were all socially constructed. The members of society generally collectively agreed that that was what was best for society at that given time. And people went along with it because we're taught from a very young age to go along with the social structures that our society has put into place, right? Other examples of the ways in which gender is a social structure is something that is socially constructed is that girls are not born with this inherent liking of Barbies or desire to play with Barbies, nor are boys born with this biological desire to play with Hot Wheels, right? Those are learned behaviors. Those are gendered behaviors that we teach boys and girls in our society because we socially constructed this idea that girls should play with dolls and boys should play with trucks, right? So those are behaviors, those are ideas that we socially constructed. So this is an important distinction here. Social structures and social constructs are not the same thing, right? Social structures are socially constructed, meaning that these guide works or these frameworks, these pathways that guide human behaviors are created by us in any given society, all right? We'll pause here and we'll pick up with this presentation in the next video.